All right, so guys, so our next session is enabling innovation using STARR. And this session, our goal is to showcase examples where we are pushing the boundaries to enhance patient care, all using STARR data. So our first speaker is Dr. Saurabh Gambhar. He's board certified in clinical pathology. He's an adjunct professor at the Department of Pathology here at the Stanford School of Medicine. He's been a member of the STARR Lab where they developed the technology that I think he's going to talk about, and that has now been spun out into a company called Atropos. Saurabh is the co-founder and chief medical officer at Atropos Health. Take it away, Saurabh.
Awesome. Can everyone see my screen? Fantastic. And thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the opening remark and Todd. So I'm going to jump right into it. So for those of you that either are clinicians or have ever interacting with clinicians, something that's ingrained into the way we practice medicine is something called evidence-based practice. And the definition is right in front of you. Evidence-based practice is the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of best current evidence and making decisions for the care of the individual. And ideally, when we see a patient, we decide, what are we going to do next? There's this mountain of evidence that says, for a specific patient, do this. It just so turns out that the arrow is not producing next, but that's okay. It just turns out that mountain of information is often a molehill. And because of that, we have something that we call the evidence gap. And so if you look at all the large randomized controlled trials that are produced every year, they tend to exclude patients that are the common patients that we actually take care of every single day. And this shows up in many ways. One, it shows up in uncertainty in care decisions. And one way it shows up in the business of medicine is how healthcare spending actually looks. So if you look at clinical trial participants, about only 20% of them have more than 2 chronic comorbid conditions. However, roughly 70% of all of healthcare spending is in that group. And it's not just the spending, it's also certain groups are just generally less representative in the evidence that we have. That would be racial, those that are housing insecure, pregnant or breastfeeding women. I think for many people during the COVID epidemic, they were probably surprised that the initial vaccine trials didn't include anyone that was pregnant or breastfeeding, despite it being such a massive component of the population. So one thing is, how do we solve that? Well, the arrow. But one way we can solve that gap is by turning to real evidence. And this basic idea is that we use sources of evidence that aren't our randomized controlled trials or published trials, but instead use information as it's collected about patients and EHRs and wearables and things like that to actually inform the care of patients that walk through the door. But if we're going to do that, we need to actually get that into a form that's digestible and usable by physicians at the bedside. So the goal, if we go back to evidence-based practice, isn't to change using evidence, but it's to now change what is current best available evidence and make that available. And so that's what the company Atropos does. And as Priya mentioned, it's a spin out of the STARR Lab at Stanford. We basically provide personalized real world evidence to inform care decisions and care protocols. And the way that the service works is that a clinician, as they are taking care of a patient, will generate an inquiry the way that they see it in their head, what they view as the evidence gap. That query will go over to our team. A clinician on our team will take a look at it and determine what is the real world evidence that we can pull from the myriad of sources that we have, including STARR OMOP data that Priya laid out, and how can we take that and do a study on that data to rapidly inform that evidence gap, and then turn that back to the physician so they can go on make a different decision. And we can do this in as little as 24 hours at Stanford. And so I think, an example is worth 1,000 words here. So I'm going to jump to a real world example that was seen at Stanford. And it might be a little small for you right now, but I'll zoom into it. But this is what one of our reports looks like. And this is something that a physician can expect back within 24 to 48 hours. And so let me just make it a little bit larger so you can see. So the question that came in, at Stanford, and they wanted to know, do patients who have an infection requiring prolonged courses of the antibiotic tedazolid have lower likelihood of developing cytopenias compared to patients who have an infection requiring prolonged courses of linezolid. So where does this question even come from? So in 2014, as part of the GAIN Act, the FDA approved this drug called tetazolid, and it had a very small clinical trial, only 300 patients total in both arms. And one of the findings was that patients who receive this drug, if they have bone marrow suppression, their bone marrow isn't so severely impacted once they receive this drug as opposed to the standard of care, which is linezolid. And so our own infectious disease group was like, hey, we don't really see that to be the case in our hands. Can you tell us if it is or is not true? So this is the way the question we received by our team. What would happen is our team would take it and make it a well-formulated clinical question. And so that would be something we conform to a PCOT format, so a population, intervention, control, and outcome. And we're very specific of how we've defined this for the user. And then how is any of this stuff actually represented in the EHR? So Priya, started to hint at there's a lot of mapping that takes place before STARR and STAR-OMOP are created, and how the data is represented is what we explain to the individual that's asking us a question. So what does it mean to have either of these drugs? What does it mean to have one of those cytopenias? And because we have a clinician on our side, we understand that cytopenia is actually a combination of 4 different clinical entities, and we define what each of those were. Once that is done, we input that into our technology stack, and out will pop a report. And that report will it'll have all the elements that you see here. The first one is a demographic figure that is you've seen in every observational study that you've ever looked at, which breaks down how big is the cohort, what is the breakdown of male, female, age distribution, and racial distribution. We also have a demographic table, which is again table 1A in every study that you've ever seen before, which has not only the same information in the figure, but also some elements that are very, very relevant to large EHR studies, like how much information do we have on these patients prior to their index event? How much follow-up information do we have? How rich are the actual records of these patients? And then finally, we take the comorbidity index, which is a thing called the Chelsea Comorbidity Index that the physicians on the call are familiar with, but it's a 17 elements of clinical history sort of tell us how sick a patient is. So things like history of diabetes, history of myocardial infarction, dementia, like that. Finally, we look at the outcomes of interest. So how many patients develop those different cytopenias in both of these arms. And here where the real magic happens is that we do all of these analyses in triplicate. So we do an unmatched analysis, so looking at everyone in both arms, regardless of their past medical history. We do a basic matching where we control for age, sex, and the year that these patients were treated. And then finally, a high dimensionality propensity score matching, which is where you look at the prior history of the entire patient and in both arms and determine if their propensity for treatment was different. And you find areas where there is overlap and compare those patients directly. And it's basically a way of making sure you're comparing apples to apples in cohorts as opposed to, your diabetic smokers over 60 in one arm, all compared to, triathlete 30-year-olds in another arm. We do that for every single outcome, and we produce a little forest plot. And then at the end, a physician on our team actually takes this finding and writes out a summary that says, hey, we identified this many patients, and this is what the finding was. In this particular case, our finding conferred to what the antibiotic stewardship committee actually thought, which is there is actually no impact on cytopenias when we're using this significantly more expensive drug, which is about 25 times more expensive for a course of treatment. So with that, let me just go back to the presentation. And so we've been live at Stanford since September, and we have had so many really interesting use cases of this, looking at everything from COVID to obstetric care, to radiation oncology, to equity of access to life-saving treatments across different ethnicities. You can read all of those on our blog, but what's really exciting is how frequently we're finding clinicians are actually engaging with a system that's completely new to them. So since September 20th, when we launched live, we've done 304 consults across 89 requesters across 23 specialties. So we love seeing that this is growing and that physicians and care protocol individuals at Stanford are really utilizing the service. This has been in a long time in the making. Dr. Shah actually wrote a paper in 2014 outlining what a service like this might look like. And we developed all this technology in the Shah lab over that course of time, and eventually ran a pilot from 2017 to 2019. The other thing that's been really interesting is that the researcher or the clinicians that are using the service, they really want to disseminate this information. So they'll find something and be so excited about it, like, what is the impact of this on all patients that look like this? And they tend to write up their findings, add an introduction and discussion to our report, and actually set them for peer review. And we've had great success navigating the peer review process. Have articles and everything from JAMA Otolaryngology to Journal of American College of Cardiology. How this all works is a really impressive tech stack. So the first thing that we do is we take all the data that we have on these comprehensive relational databases and convert them to the patient timelines that Nigam had discussed earlier in his introduction. And then we have all this custom technology built on it that allows us to very rapidly pull out the patients of interest and their entire timelines, and then formulate that for the advanced statistical analysis that I've shown. And a shout out to there is going to be a workshop later on ACE, which is the search engine that allows you to convert relational database into longitudinal patient time records. And where STARR OMOP comes into all this and is basically, they make it possible, but because they've already cleaned and mapped so much of the EHR sources, that is our initiation point for how we use the data at Stanford to answer questions for physicians of what happens to the patients they take care of every day. The other thing is not only do we have access to site-specific information like Stanford STARR OMOP data, but we also have access to national aggregate information, specialty registry information such as CancerLink, and we can also use claims data such as Truven or Optum Markets. So with that, I will turn it over to the next individual. I believe it's Martin, or I'll take any questions, I guess.
Yeah, so guys, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A. And if there are any questions, if not, we can actually go to the next speaker. And the next speaker is Dr. Susan Tanang. Susan is an instructor at the Department of Biomedical Data Science, and she's also a senior data scientist at the VA. Suzanne, the floor is yours. My bad.
Great, and also happy to share I'll be sticking around Stanford, incoming as an assistant professor in the Department of Immunology and Rheumatology. I'll be talking about joint work that Stanford researchers, STARR, and partners with the Department of Defense, essentially working on the Stanford side to validate a trauma prediction model for the purpose of FDA software as a device approval. So how can predictive analytics improve trauma outcomes? We already know that 20% of combat deaths are actually avoidable if the proper resources had been available at the point of time and event. We also know that on the civilian side, trauma deaths are actually reaching epidemic levels. So certainly an important problem to take on. Just to give you some context in which trauma can occur, certainly the military setting, combat casualties. We also have increasing number of humanitarian disasters that result in trauma events. We also have the more typical accidents on highways with ambulances speeding to the way. And unfortunately, we do have rises in various types of gun violence, especially in some locations like Philadelphia, where actually trauma events overall decreased at certain points at COVID-19, but unfortunately, gun violence incidents had increased. So solutions. I'm going to describe how we work to essentially extend a system called the Trauma Treatment Triage and Training Decision Support System that is used within both combat casualty care and also prolonged field care. Basic idea, you have a medic in the field. there's some type of event that they are responding to. They can use various sensors. These are actually created by some of our partners at the Department of Energy. And this feeds into a system that has a predictive analytics as well as a GUI and various types of information system components. It's a user-centered design. 4TDS is what that system's called. It supports model integration, refining user interfaces based on FDA requirements or field testing, the sensor interface, of course, to capture the measurements in approximately real time, the sensor interface, and then the NetWarrior device software compliant. So this is what allows it to be used for decision support in combat casualty care and also prolonged field care. Just to give you an idea of the big picture, Stanford did play one piece in that, but a really important piece. Here we are down here. I was leading the trauma data program. And really what enabled this, we had to do a lot of assessment to see if we could even proceed, but it really was having the availability of STARR data, the ease of accessing it, and then, I'll tell you a little bit more about how we were able to curate it and extend it. So fundamentally, we were testing a new algorithm that was going to be incorporated into the system called Appraise. It stands for Automated Processing of Physiologic Registry for Assessment of Injury Severity. Our goals were really to integrate this, also a massive transfusion protocol algorithm into the system to validate both the Appraise model, but also the protocol performance on FDA compliant patient medical data. That's where Stanford came in and STARR Data. Also to do this field testing, gain acceptability in the field. A lot of that is where the fine tuning of GUIs and various interfaces, and also establish this transition plan for FDA approval of the HSTAT system. This is kind of a big overview of the system. The 4TDS, this HSTAT is really the hemorrhage detection treatment system for which this project over the last year focused. So what uniquely positions STARR Data to enable innovation in trauma care? And I mentioned, we did assess a variety of data sets, not just within Stanford, but various academic and industry partners. It really is, you need very specific data for developing these and also for validating them and hoping to make that case. So the first thing is Stanford has a level 1 trauma center. Our collaborator here was Dr. David Spain, who actually leads the trauma program, but having buy-in from him and actually working with him and his team to work out some of the data collection, also some of the issues with data collection were key. Also, Dr. Spain and Shelley Woodfall, they are essentially the registry data for the National Trauma Data Bank from the Stanford Trauma Center every month. So this is for all trauma cases for which registry data is abstracted case by case by a team of nurses that Shelley leads. And some of the data requirements were not things that we could easily capture from administrative data. So it really did require this level of review and also just curation. So the ability to link this registry to STARR Data was, hugely important. The Stanford Blood Center, we also partner with. So our colleague there, Ta, but also actually Erica Ann Swenson, who is a trauma fellow. She actually helped with some of the initial validation of the data. Transfusion data can be very messy. It definitely requires curation. So working directly with Ta to link that data and make sure it only contained blood that was actually administered was key, given our goal of predicting trauma-related hemorrhage. And then the Philips bedside monitor data. So this was sort of a journey in itself, but exceptional in that many data warehouses linked to these bedside monitors don't necessarily capture data with the cadence and granularity that we needed. And we also found some things just, initially with the QA, some of our highest activity beds for bleeders or patients that had hemorrhage, at least initially weren't hooked up to these monitors. So again, kind of working closely with ED and trauma, we were able to figure out these issues, link the data. Sanjay really led that, and it was no easy task, but once it's done, it's available for everyone and quality gets better. And then also the Research Informatics Center. So they really helped coordinate this, specifically Yelena, and just really integrating both the STARR data, our clinical notes from STARR, which were de-identified and also of interest to our colleagues for the validation. So the ability to not only access, more of the standard STARR data, pull in these various curated data resources, and then also work with RIC to navigate that space and be the point person there was really, it was really great to have. Couldn't have done it without this team. So accomplishments, this is more for the broader group. We developed the HSAT system. This is really where we came in, obtaining warehoused and curated FDA compliant clinical data, integrating the prediction model. We integrated the massive transfusion protocol. We enhanced the vital tag to run appraise. So that is where the sensor measurements are collected. We developed and established the statistical analysis for the FDA clearance of appraise. We conducted the usability assessment, and we actually revised and delivered the final prototype. So all within 1 year. And I think really, remarkable to work with some of our defense colleagues, managed to get a ton done in just 1 year. So it was really intense, but I think with the help of STARR and Research IT and RIC, we really, were able to get this done and play our role. So this just is an overall picture of our data collection workflow. Initially, we were getting these cases for activated trauma patients, only those that go through the Stanford, are admitted through the Stanford ED from National Trauma Data Bank. That's the registry. That's where we link in the various data assets from the other sources. Second phase is de-identification, including the clinical notes. And then we had a final sample size about 1,375. There were a little over 60 that were bleeders or those that received blood products within the first 24 hours. And this cohort is actually available to share with others. So I'd be happy to discuss opportunities to collaborate with it moving forward. This just gives you some highlights of what key variables that we had included. These were sort of the minimal elements that were required. We certainly provided a number more, thanks to, STARR, made that just really easy to also integrate into our final cohort data set. And then just a few descriptives. So on the left, you see females, on the right, you see males. This is just the gender and BMI. And this cohort runs for 1 year of trauma cases. Here again, females on the left, males on the right. That right, of course, the majority of patients are white here, but you actually do see a good number of Asians and some Black and African Americans. And then just, another chart highlighting some of the descriptives, age, gender, and injury type. So you could see here, again, females on the left, males on the right. Males are experiencing more piercing-related, puncture-related traumas. Those are the ones, the proportion that is filled in red. Blunt injuries are the ones that are in the orange, and just a few were unresolved. So that little blue over there is the null. And yeah, I think a lot of people to put this together, not just on the Stanford side, but also working with our Department of Energy and Army colleagues. So just a thanks really to the Stanford side of the team, Leanne, Yelena, Sanjay, Michelle, Ta, David, Spain, Priya, Eric at Phillips, David, who picked up leading this as a project manager from Joe, Daniel Rubin, Bella Shu, who really just helps with keep our administrative things in line, and Riza, our finance manager. So happy to share this with you. And again, opportunities to use this in the future in student work or research. Very interested to talk about those opportunities. Okay, and then I don't know who the next speaker is, so I'm going to hand it.
So yes, absolutely. So our next speaker is Martin Seneviratne from Google Health. Martin is a medical doctor cum data scientist at Google Health. He's also a Stanford alum. Take it away, Martin. I'm sorry.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Good to see some familiar faces and names. I'm Martin. I'm calling in from London, but have very fond memories. I spent a few years in BMI a few years ago working with Nigam and Tina Hernandez-Boussard and others. I've since lost all of my hair, so may not be as recognizable to people, which is probably a reflection of, moving to London and away from the California sunshine, but so be it. So today I wanted to showcase some of the work that's going on as part of a collaboration between Google Health and the STARR Lab. It is very much work in progress that is focused around one of the points that Nigam made in his introduction, which was how to kind of integrate kind of functional and capacity evaluation concerns into the way that we test a machine learning model. So specifically, this work is based on capacity-based evaluation of outpatient risk stratification models for care managers. And we've been working closely not only with folks from the STARR Lab, so Nigam, Ron, Keith, Lance, Ethan, but also collaborators within the University Health Alliance, UHA, who run a care management program within Stanford. I should say up front that so these data, or these results, are based on a DID, or limited data set snapshot of STAR OMOD that we've been working with under a specific research statement of work with IRB approval, and that this is work in progress, and there is more to come. All right, so to begin with, one thing that we were really interested in sort of putting into action was this idea of a delivery science methodology for machine learning in healthcare. Nigam and Ron and others have published a lot on this topic, and had a Nature Digital Medicine paper a couple of years back, kind of introducing a framework for integrating delivery science and user experience research into machine learning problem formulation. So we tried to put that into action and actually hosted a number of UX workshops with real care managers and population health leadership to sort of understand what are their key pain points, and where might machine learning add unique value in their daily workflows. And in the process, we kind of fleshed out this framework that is sort of nested under Ron's original delivery science methodology, to really focus in on the first two stages of that methodology: understand the problem and design an intervention. So we've ended up packaging that into an editorial that's in submission at the moment. But basically, the key takeaway is that there are kind of four overarching questions that can help to shepherd you through the process of machine learning problem formulation. One, defining the current pain points and understanding kind of where in the workflow there is friction. Secondly, where could machine learning add unique value? Getting to the point that Nigam was also making at the head of a call around automation versus augmentation That is, are we simply automating kind of routine or mundane tasks to expedite workflows for the human, or are we augmenting and kind of adding some additional capabilities that the clinician, or in some cases the patient, are not able to do themselves? Thirdly, how will the model output be acted on? What is the actionability story after the model runs inference? And then finally, what criteria should the model be optimized for, and how can we think about?
Martin, sorry to interrupt. Are you moving your slides, because we're still seeing the main slide.
Apologies. I am, but that may not be coming through.
I had a weird Zoom issue too, Martin. So like a little.
Yeah, you want to stop sharing and try sharing again?
Yeah, let me try again.
Okay, now we see a different slide for sure.
Okay, and if I go ahead one,
yep,
does that change?
That moves.
Perfect.
Yep.
Sorry about that. That would have, yeah. So this is the framework that we're talking about, and the figure from the upcoming paper, basically talking through this sort of recipe for integrating user experience research into the sort of problem formulation stage. So putting that process into action, and after running what ended up being 5 workshops with care managers at UHA, there were several pain points that really bubbled to the surface. One around risk stratification, of identifying these rising risk patients to target outreach to. Secondly, this task of preparing for outreach. How do you identify and summarize modifiable risk factors ahead of an outreach call, which care managers are currently spending 30 to 40 minutes doing per patient? And then finally, monitoring effectiveness, measuring which interventions were beneficial to patients. And so this work is really focusing in on the first of those pain points, risk stratification. How do we identify rising risk outpatients using EHR data? So I'm just going to cherry pick a few of the key results. I'm happy to take any questions or chat with anyone in follow-up. So at a high level, this was sort of the experimental overview that we have underway. So we're exploring a few different feature sets, including both structured data only, text data only, embedded in a few different ways, and a combination of both. And our key endpoints that we're looking at are all-cause emergency admissions, which we trigger monthly. In addition, we have a number of related endpoints around unplanned admission, specifically kind of unplanned admission for congestive heart failure, for diabetes, for COPD, etc., based on AHRQ definitions. And then the last thing I'll highlight from here is the comparators box at the bottom left, which is that, one thing that became apparent from the UXR is that the current methods for identifying rising risk patients are based on rule-based heuristics, looking at recent discharges, looking at high utilization over the last 12 months. And so our comparators were drawn from that feedback, where we kind of try and compare machine learning side by side with these rule-based heuristics. I won't dwell too much on this, but suffice to say, we look at a study window of 12 years of OMOP data since 2009, and we are focusing on adult patients only who have had at least one data point recorded in the EHR within the last 30 days from the point of triggering. That is a number that we have sort of varied in the experimentation, but for the moment, that's sort of the proxy for kind of active enrollment in this care management program. One thing that may be interesting to this audience is around the featurization. So we are using OMOP data, but we are, the Google infrastructure that was originally presented in this Rajkumar paper from 2018 that Nigam was also co-author on, is based on the FHIR representation. So we actually map OMOP to the FHIR schema and then featurize that into a feature vector. This illustration is from that original paper and has, there have been some sort of minor updates since, but the key point to take away is that this sort of nested JSON style object of a FHIR resource is effectively embedded and flattened into a feature vector for the model. And that enables us to use the full gamut of structured data available in OMOP. So our feature vectors end up being in the tens of thousands or up to 100,000 in dimensionality for the structured data alone. Okay, and so then this is one of the key results. Again, this is early work that is still in development, but you see here this two figures where we're trying to emulate deployment with these capacity-based evaluation metrics. And so specifically, we're focusing on precision and recall at K, where K is the capacity of a care management team. And the idea is that, you know, if, as we found from their current workflows, they are interested in, they have a fixed capacity per week or per month of patients that can be reached out to. The key metric that is most relevant is the precision recall within those capacity constraints. And so these graphs just focus on the precision at K across a number of different look-ahead horizons. So trying to predict ED admission within the next 30 days or ED admission within the next 90 days. And the results of just one of the machine learning models that we're evaluating are shown in black. And then the results of these a number of different heuristic rule-based benchmarks are shown as horizontal lines. And so the kind of key uplift to look at is sort of this boost on the y-axis between these benchmarks and the PPV at K curve. And the takeaway really is that when capacity constraints are most stringent, that is when the capacity is low, the boost of a machine learning model over and above these rule-based baselines is greatest. And in the case of UHA, they have a small care management program, small care management staffing relative to the number of lives covered. And so this is an interesting sort of finding because kind of machine learning may have the greatest advantage under those types of capacity constraints. All right, I won't dwell too much on this, but suffice to say, we are doing some subgroup analysis as well, kind of looking at a number of different demographic breakdowns and the performance of the models across these, cognizant that there's been a lot of literature around how models based on healthcare utilization can sort of perpetuate racial biases. And so this is something that we're investigating deeply around how models across different feature sets perform on different ethnic groups, and then what might some strategies be to mitigate any performance differences. At the moment, there haven't been significant disadvantages in minority groups in terms of pure model performance, but there are a number of different metrics that we're looking at here, and this is still work under development. So given time, I'm just going to pause there and just highlight three sort of key learnings to date, which are that sort of UXR-led machine learning design can help to decide on an appropriate problem formulation and eval metrics, and help to kind of bring in the capacity and policy-based notions that Nigam had referenced at the beginning. Secondly, that what are fairly simple ML models in terms of the model architecture itself outperform traditional heuristic methods for outpatient risk stratification and may be a useful tool for care managers, with the largest performance being seen with tighter capacity constraints. And then finally, this continuous modeling where we're triggering for each patient every month in some cases, introduces complexities that we're starting to see around how do you define those triggering criteria? What is the stability of the model like over time? How does it respond to data drift, etc.? Which is a whole independent topic of research that we'll start to broach as part of this collaboration. So I'll pause there. Happy to take any questions. Priya, you're on mute.
Thank you, Martin. Please, for the attendees, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A channel, and we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speakers are Dr. Stacy Willander and Dr. Samantha Kling. Both are from the Evaluation Sciences Unit at the Primary Care and Population Health Department. Stacy is the medical director and a family physician at the Stanford School of Medicine, and she's also a Stanford alum. Samantha is a quantitative research scientist at Stanford University. Back to you, Stacy and Samantha.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having us. Just a word on the Evaluation Sciences Unit. We are a group of mixed methods researchers housed within the Division of Primary Care and Population Health at Stanford, with expertise in health services research, implementation, science, which I really think of as the gap between what we know works and what we actually do in practice. This work, I have to say, first off, was incredibly interdisciplinary and actually involved multiple institutions. Today, we'll be talking about two papers out of a suite of 5 papers that involved our colleagues in informatics, some names you're seeing currently in these presentations this morning, the Children's Hospital, Adult Hospital, Santa Clara County, trainees, our nursing colleagues. So it's really been just a tremendous pleasure. This group will certainly be familiar with the rise in telemedicine. COVID removed traditional barriers that existed. We saw full parity, we saw the ability to practice across state lines, and we also saw new platforms that were allowed, Zoom, WebEx, FaceTime, and so forth. And so what did that mean in terms of telemedicine in acute care settings? So telemedicine has historically focused on connecting patients with remote care, but COVID allowed us to explore this technology as an infection control measure. And at the time, early in the emergency, just following the emergency declaration, I was really only able to find 2 papers looking at telemedicine for this specific use case as an infection control measure rather than just using it for remote care. This was pretty remarkable and represented a brand new area of research that really motivated us. The way that we've thought about telemedicine being focused on remote care has been so ingrained in us that it's actually built into the definitions. This was prior to COVID-19. So telemedicine, connecting patients with a physician at a distance site or long distance clinical care. But really we're talking about in telemedicine in the acute care setting. So we'll be talking about the emergency department and also the inpatient setting. Really that care is happening on the other side of the door. And so what does that look like in terms of, does it work? How is it impacting clinical workflows? And how does it impact quality outcomes and so forth? So that's Adele's famous song, "Hello from the Other Side of the Door." Stanford was remarkably quick to respond, and I credit Topher Sharp, Rajiv Ramdeo, and their team with rolling this out. We saw, tablets available pretty much right away in the emergency department, helping staff feel safer than, and other patients who were not patients under investigation feel safer than they would have otherwise. And the additional rollout in the inpatient setting. In these early phases, they used simply tablets Zoom-based services and on carts. We did our first paper described this same response in the children's setting and then at the County of Santa Clara. And it was interesting. We use Zoom, children's, I think, used FaceTime, and County of Santa Clara used WebEx. So it was kind of a free-filled, anybody doing what they needed to do. So we at the Evaluation Sciences Unit like to practice embedded research. So we like to partner alongside clinician and operational partners to really understand what impact the innovative things that they're doing are having on clinical care and other healthcare outcomes. This is our suite of 5 papers. We'll be talking about the impact in the emergency department and the impact of this inpatient telemedicine on nursing movement in the inpatient setting. And just a word on the data. This real-time locating system data, we linked up with Birju Patel, who is a clinical informatics fellow, now is at Google, and I saw his name on the last presentation. And he and I were sort of chatting and realized that this would be a really interesting data set to evaluate this using these tablets to conduct clinical care. So once you have the tablet outside the door, how does that change the number of times physicians and nurses and other members of the clinical care team enter the room? This data is captured. There is a token on badges. It sends a ping up to a receiver that is located within each room. And so you get this massive data set with the employee ID, timestamp, and a room number. And you can use that to start to draw conclusions around how workflow is changing. This data had to be extracted, de-identified, and limited to just what was absolutely needed in order to have our various stakeholders feel comfortable. And just to highlight that, we had our leader, the TOEFR was on board of clinical informatics. Our nursing leadership was on board with Nigam Shah's support. And so that's how we were able to use this data. Now we'll turn it over to Sam to talk about our quantitative papers.
Thanks, Stacy. And yes, I will start first briefly going through the results of the emergency department study and then the inpatient study. But both of these papers are now going to be available. So please reach out if you would like copies. So first in the ED study, this study took place 4 weeks before the stay-at-home orders and before this implementation of Zoom and hardware, and 4 weeks after the implementation of Zoom and hardware. So very short-term study. And within this time, we captured about 7,000 patients in the ED. And it's about 200 nurses all wearing that RTLS badge, and about 50 of the 160 physicians in the emergency department at the time. As Stacy said, we captured events where a nurse or physician entered a patient room. And within this short 8-week study, we were able to capture about 16,000 unique room entrances. So a lot of data to look at to capture how these workflows changed in response to telemedicine and COVID. Next slide, please. In the study, we didn't find a lot of things around a lot of interesting things around the number of times people entered rooms. So here we're looking at how long did nurses and physicians spend in rooms. And pre compared to post implementation, the amount of time nurses and physicians spent in rooms did not differ between these two time periods. However, we saw an increase in the amount of time patients were spending on telemedicine with providers. It was 4.3 minutes pre-implementation of Zoom and the hardware versus 12 minutes during the post-implementation phase. This, however, did not affect the total duration of care patients received during this highly changing time. So this suggests that telemedicine complemented our telemedicine used to complement direct patient care and not replace it. However, this evaluation is limited we only captured a subset of physicians with the RTLS badge, so we realized that we may not have captured all the care taking place. So in the next study, we decided to look at nursing because they were using the RTLS badges. They provide a lot of that direct in-person care, and patients are in inpatient units longer than the ED, so potentially able to capture more workflow changes in response to telemedicine. Next slide, please. So the aim of this study, we compared the primary COVID unit in 500p to 4 comparison units, also in 500p. The COVID unit had telemedicine hardware installed in each patient room immediately when the pandemic started ramping up, where the comparison units had shared hardware units installed. The data we were able to capture longer, 1 year, so pre-pandemic through the middle of the second surge of the pandemic. Next slide. So in blue on these two graphs, we can see how telemedicine was adopted and with the mean number of calls per patient. So as you can see, the primary COVID-19 unit rapidly adopted the Zoom calls, where comparison units really didn't adopt Zoom until the second surge. And we see peaks in the COVID unit with highest utilization occurring in those very early stages of the pandemic, and then during surge 1 and surge 2. The red and black lines represent the mean number of nurse entrances into patient's room per patient. And we saw in the COVID unit, the number of room entrances decreased as compared to baseline, but did not change for the COVID unit. So nurses in the COVID unit were entering rooms less frequently, and this dipped especially around the times of the early stages, that telemedicine rollout period and our stay-at-home orders, and then surge 1 and surge 2. Next slide, please. So along with entrances, we looked at the duration spent in room, and oppositely, we found that duration per room entrance increased in the COVID unit, but did not change in the comparison units. So as nurses were entering rooms less frequently, they were spending longer in the room per entrance, suggesting batching of workflows. Next. So overall, nurse and patient encounters increased in frequency, or those are opposite, I'm sorry, decrease in frequency and increase in duration. So total bedside time was not impacted, and this potentially reduced risk of infection and PPE use. So entering the room less frequently means less donning and doffing of the PPE. Next slide, please. So overall, we think both of these studies suggest that telemedicine in the inpatient setting is used to complement patient care and not replace it. Beyond this application of telemedicine, this also shows that RTLS data at Stanford can capture meaningful workflows, building on prior studies looking at physician and nurse workflows. So both can capture changes in those workflows in response to intervention and also describe what is currently going on in the hospital. However, as Stacy said, this is highly sensitive data and requires leadership buy-in to get access, stakeholder engagement throughout the process to understand both what data we should pull, along with the changes happening throughout the hospital, and then finally interpretation of the final results to really inform targeted, thoughtful use of the data and these results. And thank you. And if we have time for questions, we're happy
absolutely.
to answer.
And I think people will just post questions in the Q&A. So we can just wait for a couple of minutes.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.